They caught him stealing. Yet by sunrise, he stood in the doorway as something else entirely, something he didn't understand and couldn't yet name. The desert had a way of stripping a man down to what he really was. And Ethan Cole had been reduced to hunger, 3 days of it clawing at his insides like dry wind scraping across bone. His boots kicking up dust along a forgotten trail where even coyotes thought twice about lingering. And that was when he saw the house, sitting alone against the horizon like it had been placed there by a hand that didn't care who found it. No fences, no smoke, no sign of life. Just stillness, the kind that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat sounds too loud. Folks in the last town had warned him without really saying it. Eyes shifting, voices dropping. No one goes out that way. But hunger doesn't listen to warnings. It doesn't care about stories or shadows. It just moves your feet forward one step at a time until you're standing where you shouldn't be. The door wasn't locked, which unsettled him more than if it had been barred shut, because out here, anything left open usually meant one of two things, abandonment or certainty, and something about the place didn't feel abandoned. He stepped inside slow, boots quiet against worn wood, the air cooler than outside, carrying a faint scent of sage and something older, something that didn't belong to dust and cattle. His eyes adjusting to the dim light as he scanned for anything worth taking, not gold, not even money, just food, something to settle the ache twisting inside him. And there it was on a small table, a loaf of bread, fresh enough that it hadn't gone hard yet. Beside it a silver bracelet, simple but clean, catching the thin beam of sunlight slipping through the window. He hesitated, just for a second, because things left in the open like that felt like a test, but tests don't fill an empty stomach. So he reached out, fingers closing around the bread first, feeling the softness give under his grip, and for a moment, relief washed through him so strong it almost made him forget where he was. Then he took the bracelet, not because he needed it, but because a man like him didn't leave value behind when he found it. Even if he couldn't explain why it felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just silver. He turned toward the door, already thinking about distance, about how far he could get before anyone noticed, about the next town, and maybe a hot meal, if luck finally decided to remember his name. And that's when the door closed behind him with a quiet, final sound that didn't echo, didn't slam, just settled into place like it had always been meant to be shut. He froze, every instinct sharpening at once. Not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that tells you the world just shifted without asking your permission. Put it back. The voice came from the shadows, steady, calm, not raised, not hurried, just there, like it had been waiting longer than he had. Ethan turned slowly, because quick movements belonged to men who thought they still had control, and he'd learned a long time ago that control was something the desert took from you without warning, his eyes finding her. Where the light didn't quite reach, a woman standing still, hands empty, posture relaxed, as if nothing about this moment concerned her at all, and that was what unsettled him most, not anger, not fear, just certainty. She stepped forward just enough for the light to catch her face, strong lines, eyes dark and steady, watching him not like a thief, not like a threat, but like something already decided. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. I didn't see a name on it, he said, his voice rough from disuse, trying to sound like a man who still had choices, even though something in the room suggested otherwise. She didn't respond right away, just looked at the bread in his hand, then the bracelet, then back at him, as if weighing something he couldn't see, and the silence stretched long enough that he almost spoke again just to break it, but he held back, because sometimes silence tells you more than words ever will. You came a long way for something small, she said finally, her tone unchanged, and he almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because she was right in a way that made him feel exposed, like she could see every mile written across his boots. Small's enough when you've got nothing, he answered, shifting his weight slightly, testing the space between them, the distance to the door, the way her gaze didn't follow his movement like most people's would, like she wasn't worried about him leaving at all. That was when it hit him, slow and heavy, that he wasn't being stopped, not by force, not by threat, but by something else entirely, something he couldn't name yet, and that unsettled him more than any drawn gun ever could. The bracelet felt heavier in his hand now, the bread less certain. And for the first time since he stepped inside, Ethan Cole wondered if taking those things had already cost him more than he understood. The room did not change, but something inside it had. The air felt thicker now, like the silence had weight, and Ethan Cole stood there with a loaf of bread in one hand and a silver bracelet in the other, realizing for the first time in a long while that he was not the one deciding how this moment would end. The woman did not step closer, did not raise her voice. She simply waited, and that waiting pressed against him harder than any demand could have, because men like him knew how to react to threats, to anger, even to fear. But calm like this, calm that did not bend or break, that was something else entirely. He glanced at the door behind him, still closed, still quiet. No lock in sight, no barrier he could point to, yet it felt farther away than it had a minute ago, like distance had stretched without moving. "You going to stand there all day?" he asked, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he could shape with words, but his voice did not carry the weight he wanted it to. It sounded thinner, uncertain in a way he did not like. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone studies a horizon before deciding which direction to take. And when she spoke again, her words came slow, measured, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. "If I wanted you gone, you would have left already." And there was no arrogance in it, no challenge, just a statement so simple it left no room to argue. Ethan shifted his grip on the bread, feeling the softness again, the reminder of why he had stepped inside in the first place. Hunger, plain and honest, not pride, not greed, just the kind of need that makes a man forget where he is supposed to draw his lines. "Then what do you want?" he asked, and this time the question came out real, stripped of pretense, because he could feel it now. This was not about the bread, not about the bracelet, not even about him breaking into her home. It was about something else, something he had not seen yet. She moved then, one slow step into the light, and he noticed the details he had missed before. The way her clothes carried both the marks of the land and something more deliberate. The way she stood not like someone guarding a place, but like someone who belonged to it in a way that ran deeper than ownership. And her eyes, steady, patient, held his without pressing, without forcing, just there, unshaken. "You walked in here with nothing," she said, "and still thought you could take something and leave unchanged." And the words settled between them, not sharp, not accusing, just true in a way that made his chest tighten again. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, a dry sound that almost turned into a laugh, but did not quite make it. "That is how it works where I come from," he said, though even as he spoke he knew that place did not follow him here. Whatever rules he had lived by had been left somewhere out on that trail behind him. She looked at the bracelet in his hand, and for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in her expression, not anger, not concern, something closer to recognition, like she was seeing it again after a long time. Then her gaze returned to him. "Put them down," she said quietly, and this time it was not a suggestion. Ethan hesitated, not because he was weighing the cost, but because something in him resisted the idea that this moment could be that simple, that he could just set the items back and walk away like nothing had happened, because he could feel it. Now, the moment had already changed him in some small way he could not yet name. Still, his fingers loosened, and he placed the bread back on the table first, then the bracelet. Beside it, the silver catching the same thin line of light, and as he did, he felt something unexpected, not relief, not regret, something quieter, like a line had been crossed and then erased at the same time. He straightened slowly, eyes returning to hers, waiting now without meaning to, waiting the same way she had been waiting, and that realization sat strange in his chest. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like a wall and more like a space being filled with something unseen. Then she spoke, and the words did not come with force, did not rise or fall. They simply arrived. "You should have taken more." And Ethan blinked, caught off guard, the sentence not fitting anywhere he expected it to. "What?" he asked, and for the first time, there was a hint of something in his voice that sounded like confusion instead of caution. She stepped closer, close enough now that he could see the fine lines in the silver bracelet, the way it had been worn smooth in places, the kind of wear that comes from years, not from display. And when she looked back at him, there was no softness there. But there was something else, something deliberate, something that made the next words feel heavier before she even spoke them. Because now, she said, you owe me more than what you took. And Ethan felt it then, clear and sharp. Not danger, not fear, but the sense that whatever this was, whatever had begun the moment he stepped through that door, it was not finished, not even close, and walking away might no longer be an option he could choose. The words did not echo, but they stayed, hanging in the air between them like something already decided, and Ethan Cole felt his jaw tighten slightly as he tried to measure what exactly he owed, and how a loaf of bread and a bracelet could turn into something heavier than any debt he had carried before. I put it back, he said, his voice low, steady enough to pass for calm, though something underneath it had begun to shift, something that told him this was no longer about simple choices or clean exits. Ayanna Redhawk did not argue, did not correct him. She simply watched him the way the land watches a storm roll in, not stopping it, not fearing it, just knowing what it brings. You think debt is counted by objects, she said, her tone unchanged. But out here, it is counted by moments. And that word settled differently. Moments, not dollars, not goods, something less tangible and far more difficult to escape. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting for a second toward the window where the light had shifted just enough to show that time had moved on without asking either of them. The sun climbing higher, the day beginning, whether he was ready or not. Then say what you want, he replied, and there was something more direct in him now, less defensive, as if part of him had already accepted that leaving was no longer a simple matter of turning a handle and stepping outside. She stepped closer again, not invading, not crowding, just enough to make the distance between them feel intentional. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It simply became clearer, like something coming into focus. Stay, she said, and the word landed without force, without demand, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. Ethan blinked once, the simplicity of it catching him off guard more than any threat could have. Stay, he repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it less real, might give him something to push against. She nodded slightly, her gaze never leaving his. Not for the house, not for the things in it, she added. For what comes next. And that was when the unease in his chest sharpened into something more defined. Not fear, not yet, but the clear understanding that whatever she was asking was not temporary, not casual. It was something that would reach beyond this room, beyond this moment. You do not even know me, he said, and there was truth in it, a truth he held on to like it might still anchor him somewhere familiar. Ayanna's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not softer, not harder, just deeper. I know enough, she answered. And the certainty in that sentence settled heavier than anything else she had said. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his hand brushing against his coat, as if checking for something that was no longer there, a habit from a life that suddenly felt distant. And if I say no? He asked. Not as a challenge, but as a question he needed answered, because a man needed to know where the edges were before he decided whether to step over them. For the first time, she did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like she was giving him space to hear something beyond her words. Then she turned slightly, her gaze shifting past him toward the door, and Ethan followed it without meaning to. The door remained closed, quiet, unchanged, and yet something about it felt different now, like it no longer represented a clean way out, like stepping through it would carry more than just his boots back into the dust. You can leave, she said finally, her voice calm, certain. But you will not leave unchanged. And the way she said it made it clear she was not threatening him. She was telling him something he had already begun to understand. Ethan swallowed once, his throat dry again, though hunger had taken a back seat to something else. Entirely, something heavier, more complicated, and he found himself looking back at the table where the bread and bracelet rested, untouched, exactly where he had placed them, as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had. He took a slow step toward the door, not because he had decided, but because he needed to feel the distance, needed to test whether it was still his to cross, his boots sounding louder now against the floor, each step marking something he could not quite define. And when he reached the door, his hand hovered near it, not touching, just there, suspended between action and hesitation. Behind him, the room remained still. Ayana did not move, did not call out, did not stop him, and that absence of pressure pressed harder than anything else could have. Ethan stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the day outside, the miles waiting for him, the hunger that would return, the life he understood. Simple, harsh, predictable. And then he felt something else. Quieter, less familiar. The sense that if he stepped out now, he would carry this moment with him in a way he could not set down. That the question she had placed in front of him would follow him farther than any trail he had walked. His fingers brushed the wood of the door, rough beneath. His skin, real, solid, and yet his hand did not push, did not pull. It just rested there. And slowly, almost without noticing, he turned his head back toward her. Not fully, just enough to see her standing where she had been, unchanged, waiting not for his answer, but for him to understand it. And in that quiet, stretched moment, Ethan Cole realized that leaving was still possible, but it was no longer simple, and staying was no longer unthinkable. And somewhere between those two truths, something inside him had already begun to choose. His hand did not move, not forward, not back, just resting against the door as if the wood itself might give him an answer, but it did not. It stayed firm beneath his palm, steady in a way that reminded him of something he had not felt in a long time, something like certainty. And that was when Ethan Cole slowly pulled his hand away. The motion was small, almost unnoticeable, but inside him it felt like a line being crossed, quiet, irreversible, the kind that does not make a sound but changes. The ground beneath your feet. He did not turn all the way at first, just shifted enough to take her in again. Ayana Redhawk still standing where she had been, unchanged, as if she had known from the beginning that the door would not open. Not really. If I stay, he said, his voice lower now, less guarded. It is not because I owe you bread and silver. And the words came slowly, each one chosen with care, because something in him understood that this was no longer a moment for careless speech. She inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in challenge, simply acknowledging that he had spoken, and in that small gesture there was a kind of respect that he had not expected. No, she said. It is because you see what you did not see before. And the sentence settled between them like something that had always been true, waiting to be recognized. Ethan let out a breath that felt different from the ones before, less tight, less driven by instinct, and he took a step away from the door, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. And with that step the distance between leaving and staying shifted again, not as a question now, but as a choice already moving toward its answer. What happens next? He asked. And this time there was no edge in it, no attempt to control the direction, just a question from a man who understood that he had stepped into something larger than himself. Ayana turned slightly toward the table, her hand moving to the bracelet, not picking it up, just touching it lightly, as if feeling the weight of it without lifting it. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty that had followed her from the beginning. You learn the land, she said, and the land learns you. And Ethan frowned faintly, not in disagreement, but because the answer did not fit into the patterns he was used to. It did not come with clear steps or simple expectations. That sounds like a long way of saying nothing, he replied, though there was no bite in it, just an attempt to find footing in unfamiliar ground. For the first time, something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth, not wide, not lingering, just enough to change the shape of the moment. It is a long way, she said, because there are no shortcuts here. And that word again, here, carried more than just the walls around them. It meant the land outside, the people beyond it, the space between worlds that he had only just begun to sense. Ethan glanced toward the window, the light brighter now, stretching farther across the floor, the day moving forward without pause. And he realized that time had not slowed for this moment. It had simply allowed him to catch up to it. And if I fail? He asked, the question coming out quieter than the others, because failure was something he understood, something that had followed him longer than most things, and he needed to know if it would follow him here as well. Ayana looked at him fully then, her gaze steady, not soft, not harsh, just clear. Then you will know why you failed, she said, and there was no comfort in the words. But there was honesty, the kind that did not pretend things would be easier than they were. Ethan nodded once, slowly, because that answer, strange as it was, felt more real than any reassurance could have, and for the first time since he stepped inside, he felt something settle in him, not certainty, not confidence, but a willingness to stand in the space he had chosen. He moved farther into the room now, not as a trespasser, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had decided to remain, and the shift was subtle, invisible to anyone who might have been watching, but to him it felt like the difference between drifting and standing. The bread still rested on the table, the bracelet beside it, unchanged, and yet they no longer looked like things he had tried to take. They looked like markers, reminders of where this had begun and how far it had already moved. "What do I do first?" he asked, and there was something new in the question, not urgency, not impatience, just readiness. Ayana stepped back slightly, giving him space, not directing him, not guiding him with gestures, just opening the room in a way that made it feel larger than it had before. "You listen," she said, "before you speak, before you act, before you decide what you think you know." And Ethan almost smiled at that, a faint shift in his expression that did not quite reach his eyes, because it sounded simple, and yet he could already feel how difficult it would be. He turned his head toward the open space beyond the window, toward the land stretching out in quiet waves of dust and light, and for the first time, he did not see it as something to cross or survive, but as something that might speak if he gave it the chance. Behind him, the room remained still, Ayana watching, not waiting for him to prove anything, not measuring him against some unseen standard, just there, present, certain in a way that did not need to be shown. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the silence no longer pressing, no longer heavy, just wide, open, and as he drew in a slow breath, the kind that fills more than just the lungs, he understood something he had not expected, that the moment he thought would end when he chose to stay was only just beginning, and whatever came next would not be decided in a single step, but in every quiet one that followed. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt like something waiting to be understood, and Ethan Cole stood there with his eyes on the horizon beyond the window, trying to hear what Ayana meant without asking her to explain it again. The wind outside moved across the dry ground in long, slow breaths, carrying dust and thin ribbons that caught the light, and for the first time in years, he did not see it as something to endure, but as something that had been there long before him and would remain long after, steady in a way that made his own life feel like a passing shadow. "Listening does not feed a man," he said after a moment, not to challenge her, but to test the truth of it against what he had always known, because hunger still lived in him, quieter now, but not gone. Ayana did not turn toward him immediately, her attention resting somewhere beyond the walls, as if she could hear things he could not yet reach, and when she answered, her voice carried that same calm weight. "No, but it teaches him where to find what does." And Ethan considered that, the words settling slowly, not giving him an answer he could use right away, but pointing him somewhere he had not thought to look before. He shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against the wood, the sound grounding him in the present, and he realized that every small movement felt different now, not because the room had changed, but because he had, even if he could not yet say how. "Then I start with the land," he said, more to himself than to her, testing the idea as he spoke it, and for the first time, the thought did not feel like a burden, it felt like a direction. Ayana stepped closer to the table again, her fingers brushing the edge of the bread before she broke off a small piece and held it out toward him, not as an offering, not as a reward, just as something simple and real. Ethan hesitated only for a second before taking it, the warmth still faint in the loaf, the texture soft between his fingers, and when he brought it to his mouth, the taste settled deeper than he expected, not because it was extraordinary, but because it came without the sharp edge of need that had driven him before. He chewed slowly, aware of the moment in a way he had not been when he first grabbed the bread, and as he swallowed, he felt something shift again, small, but undeniable. "You did not have to let me stay," he said, the words quiet, not heavy with gratitude, but honest in a way that felt unfamiliar on his tongue. Ayana looked at him then, her gaze steady. "You did not have to stay," she replied, and the balance in that sentence settled between them, equal, unforced, as if neither of them had given more than the other. Ethan nodded once, accepting that, because it felt right, even if he could not fully explain why. The light had moved farther now, stretching across the floor toward the far wall, and the day outside had grown brighter, sharper, the kind of clarity that leaves no room for hiding. And Ethan felt it in himself as well, a clarity that did not simplify things, but made them harder to ignore. "What am I supposed to hear?" he asked after a moment, his voice lower again, not because he doubted her, but because he needed something to begin with, something to hold on to as he stepped into this new way of seeing. Ayana turned toward the door, not opening it, just standing near it, her hand resting lightly against the wood where his had been before, and she listened for a moment before speaking. "Not with your ears," she said. "With what you do not use yet." And Ethan frowned slightly, the answer slipping past the edges of his understanding, but not entirely out of reach. He followed her movement, stepping closer to the door, feeling the same wood beneath his hand. Now, but it no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a threshold, something that marked a change rather than prevented one. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not out of habit, but because something in him suggested it. And in that brief darkness, he noticed things he had not before, the rhythm of his breathing, slower now, the faint movement of air against his skin, the distant sound of wind crossing open ground, not loud, not demanding, just present. When he opened his eyes again, the room looked the same, but it felt different, wider somehow, as if the space had expanded without moving its walls. "I think I hear it," he said, though he was not entirely sure what he meant, and Ayana did not correct him, did not confirm it. She simply stepped back, giving him space again, as if the next step belonged to him alone. Ethan stood there for a long moment, his hands still near the door, the bread settling in his stomach, the bracelet catching the light behind him. And for the first time since he had walked into that house, he did not feel like he was passing through someone else's world. He felt like he had been invited into it, not by force, not by debt, but by something quieter, something that did not need to be named to be understood. And as he drew in another slow breath, steady and full, he realized that the hunger that had brought him there was no longer the only thing guiding him, and whatever came next would not be about taking, but about learning how to remain. The air outside felt different the moment Ethan Cole stepped through the door, not colder, not warmer, just wider, like the world had stretched while he was inside. And for a second he stood there on the wooden threshold, neither fully in nor out, his boots catching the edge between two ways of living that no longer fit together the way they had before. The light hit him clean, no shadows to hide in, the sun already climbing past mid-morning, and the land rolled out in front of him in long, quiet waves of dust and pale grass, broken only by scattered rocks and the faint outline of distant ridges that shimmered in the heat. He took a slow breath, deeper than the ones before, letting it settle, not rushing it out like he used to when every second felt like it needed to be spent moving, surviving, getting somewhere else. Behind him, the door remained open, not calling him back, not pushing him forward, just there. And he realized that for the first time in years, he was not being chased by anything, not hunger, not men, not his own past, at least not in the way he understood it before. He stepped down onto the dry ground, boots pressing into the dirt with a firm, grounded sound, and paused again, because something in him told him not to rush this, not to turn it into another road to cross. The wind moved across the land in a low, steady sweep, carrying the faint scent of sage and sun-warmed earth, and he found himself listening the way she had told him, not with effort, not forcing it, just allowing the space to exist around him. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet he had always known, the kind that most men tried to escape. But as he stood there, letting his shoulders drop, letting his breath slow, he noticed something beneath it, a pattern, not a sound exactly, more like a rhythm. The way the wind shifted direction slightly before settling. Again, the way the grass leaned and then straightened, the way the distant ridges seemed to hold still even as everything else moved. "You hear it." Ayana's voice came from behind him, not loud, not surprising, just present, and he did not turn right away, because turning felt like it would break something fragile that had just begun to form. "I think I do," he answered, though the words felt too small for what he was beginning to notice. She stepped out beside him then, her movement quiet, natural, as if she belonged to the space in a way he was only just beginning to understand. And she did not look at him. She looked at the land, the same way he was learning to do. "It does not speak the way you expect," she said, and he nodded slightly, because that much had already become clear. He shifted his weight, feeling the ground beneath his boots, firm but not unyielding, and for a moment he closed his eyes again, not to block anything out, but to let something else come forward, and this time the rhythm was easier to notice, the way the air moved across his skin, the way his own breathing began to match it without him trying. When he opened his eyes, the land did not look different, but it felt more defined, as if it had been waiting for him to stop moving long enough to see it clearly. "What am I supposed to do with it?" he asked, and there was no impatience in the question, just a need to understand how this changed anything real. Ayana glanced at him then, in his mind, because movement had always been his answer to everything. If something went wrong, he left. If something became difficult, he pushed through it or moved past it. But this was different. This was asking him to slow down, to match something outside himself instead of forcing his way through it. He took a few steps forward, not toward anything specific, just into the open space, and paid attention to how his boots met the ground, how each step felt when he did not rush it, when he did not treat it like a means to an end. The distance between him and the house grew slowly, and he was aware of it, not measuring it in feet or yards, but in moments, each step marking something he had not paid attention to before. Behind him, Ayana remained near the doorway, not following, not calling him back, and that absence of direction gave him something unexpected, the freedom to choose without being pushed. He walked until he reached a patch of dry grass that bent low under the wind, and he stopped there, watching the way it moved, not randomly, but in a pattern that repeated just enough to feel intentional. He crouched slightly, his hand brushing against the grass, feeling its texture, dry but not lifeless, and for a moment he stayed there, letting the sensation settle, letting it become part of what he was learning. The sun climbed higher, the heat growing stronger, pressing against his shoulders, and he realized that time was still moving, the day still unfolding, but he was no longer trying to outrun it. After a while, he stood again, turning back toward the house, not because he felt pulled, but because he understood that this, too, was part of it, returning, not leaving everything behind. When he reached the doorway, Ayana was still there, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because words felt unnecessary in the space that had formed between them. Then he nodded once, a small movement, but certain, and said, "I understand a little," and she nodded in return, not approving, not correcting, just acknowledging that he had taken the first step into something that would not be finished quickly. And as he stood there, the land stretching behind him and the quiet room waiting ahead, Ethan Cole realized that the path he had chosen was not one he could measure in miles, but in moments like this, slow, deliberate, and impossible to rush. The afternoon stretched long across the land, the kind of slow, steady time that did not rush for anyone, and Ethan Cole stood just outside the doorway, feeling it settle into him in a way he had never allowed before, not because he did not have the chance, but because he had never stayed still long enough to notice. The sun had climbed higher now, pressing heat into the ground until the air itself seemed to shimmer, and the horizon blurred slightly at the edges, not disappearing, just softening, like something that did not need to be sharp to be real. He shifted his stance, boots planted firmly in the dust, and looked out again, not searching this time, not measuring distance or escape, just observing, letting his eyes rest where they wanted instead of forcing them forward. Behind him, the quiet of the house remained unchanged, steady, patient, and Ayana did not move to fill the silence, did not step forward to guide him, and that absence had begun to feel less like distance and more like trust. He took a slow breath, deeper than before, letting it settle fully before releasing it, and with it came a realization he had not expected, that the stillness he had always avoided was not empty. It was full, filled with small things that only appeared when everything else stopped moving. A faint sound reached him then, not loud, not sudden, just present, and it took him a moment to understand what it was. The soft creak of something shifting far off, followed by a low, Distant rhythm, steady and measured, like footsteps carried across open ground. His head turned slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to place it, not reacting, just noticing. And for a moment he almost dismissed it as wind or memory. But the rhythm held, too even to ignore. Ayana's voice came quietly from behind him. Do not turn too fast. And the words slowed him, not as a command, but as a reminder. And he let his movement settle, turning just enough to see without breaking the calm that had formed. On the far ridge, barely more than shapes against the light, figures had appeared, small at this distance, but unmistakable once seen. Mounted, still, watching, and Ethan felt the shift in his chest, not fear, not yet, but awareness sharpening. The same instinct that had kept him alive for years, now meeting something new, something he did not fully understand. You expected them, he said, his voice low, not questioning, just stating what had become clear, and Ayana stepped forward to stand beside him again, her gaze resting on the distant riders without tension, without urgency. They expected you, she replied, and that answer settled differently, turning the moment slightly, placing him not as an observer, but as part of something already in motion. Ethan's eyes remained on the ridge, counting without meaning to 1, 2, 3 figures, maybe more just beyond the line of sight, their outlines steady against the shifting heat, and none of them moved closer, none of them signaled. They simply remained, present, waiting in a way that felt deliberate. They have been there long? He asked, and she nodded once. Long enough, she said, and there was no explanation beyond that, no need for one. Ethan shifted his weight again, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just grounding himself in the space he occupied, and he remembered what she had said, about letting the land change how you move, and he realized this was part of it, not reacting, not rushing, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it into something it was not. The wind moved again, brushing past him, carrying a faint echo of that same rhythm, hooves against dry earth, distant but steady, and he felt his breathing adjust to it without thinking, slower, more measured. What do they want? He asked after a moment, and this time the question held more weight, not because he feared the answer, but because he understood it might not be simple. Ayana did not answer right away, her eyes still on the ridge, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm. But there was something beneath it now, something older, something that did not belong to just this moment. To see, she said, what you will do. And Ethan felt that settle in him, not as pressure, but as awareness, that this was not just about him staying or leaving anymore. It was about what that choice meant beyond himself. He glanced at her then, just briefly, noting the steadiness in her posture, the absence of concern. Not because nothing was happening, but because she understood it in a way he did not yet, and that realization did not unsettle him the way it might have before. It anchored him, gave him something to stand on. He turned his gaze back to the ridge, the figures still there, unchanged, patient, and for the first time, he did not see them as a threat to avoid, but as part of the same land he was learning to understand, part of the same rhythm he had begun to hear. The distance between them remained wide and quiet, and Ethan did not move to close it, did not reach for anything he did not need. He simply stood, letting the moment hold, letting his breath match the wind, letting his presence settle into the space instead of pushing against it. Time passed, not marked by clocks or miles, but by the slow shift of light across the ground, and the figures on the ridge did not leave, did not approach. They remained, watching, waiting, as if the answer they were looking for was not something that could be taken, but something that had to be shown. And as Ethan stood there, the house at his back, the open land before him, and those distant eyes resting on him without judgment, he understood something that had not been clear before, that staying was not the end of the choice he had made. It was the beginning of being seen, not for what he had been, but for what he would decide to become next. The figures on the ridge did not move, and that was what made their presence heavier than if they had been riding fast or calling out across the distance. Because stillness like that carried intention, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Ethan Cole stood where he was, the wind brushing past him in steady intervals, his breathing matching it without effort now, and for a moment, the world felt balanced, the house behind him, the land ahead, and those distant riders holding their place. as if waiting for something that had not yet happened. They are patient, he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the ridge, and Ayanna Redhawk gave a slight nod beside him. They have learned to be, she replied, and there was something in her voice that suggested that patience had not come easily, that it had been shaped over time, just like the land itself. Ethan shifted his stance again, not restless, just aware, and he realized that the old instinct to act, to do something, to break the stillness before it broke him, had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that did not rush to fill every silence. The sun pressed down stronger now, the heat rising off the ground in waves that made the distant shapes blur and sharpen at the same time, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, not straining, just observing, letting the image settle instead of forcing it into clarity. If they are waiting to see what I do, he said after a moment, then doing nothing is still a choice. And the words came out more certain than he expected, not because he had planned them, but because they felt true the moment he spoke them. Ayanna turned her head just enough to look at him, her gaze steady, measuring not his words but the way he stood with them, and after a brief pause, she said, "Most men mistake stillness for weakness," and Ethan let out a faint breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "I used to be one of them," he admitted, and there was no shame in it, just recognition. The wind shifted slightly, coming from a different direction now, cooler for a brief second before settling again, and Ethan noticed it, not as a distraction, but as part of the pattern he was learning to follow. The way the land spoke without needing words. "So what happens if I move?" he asked, not because he intended to, but because he wanted to understand the edges of this moment, where it would bend and where it would hold. Ayanna looked back toward the ridge, her eyes calm. "Then they will learn something different," she said. And again, no warning, no instruction, just truth placed in front of him without weight. Ethan considered that, the simplicity of it, and he realized that whatever these riders were watching for, it was not a specific action, not a right or wrong step. It was something else, something deeper, the way a man carried himself in a moment where he could choose either way. He took a slow breath, feeling it settle fully before releasing it. And then he did something that would have felt impossible to him just a day before. He relaxed his shoulders completely, letting the tension leave his body, not forcing it out, just allowing it to drop, and with it, the need to prove anything, to anyone, even to himself. The land did not react, the riders did not shift, but something in the air felt different, not visible, not measurable, just a subtle change, like a note in a song that had been slightly off now settling into place. Time stretched again, not empty, but full of small movements, the wind, the light, the distant shapes holding steady, and Ethan remained where he was, not frozen, not rigid, just present, his boots planted, his gaze steady, his breath even. After a while, he noticed something new, not in himself this time, but on the ridge. One of the figures had shifted slightly, not forward, not back, just enough to break the perfect stillness that had defined them before. And it was subtle, so subtle that he might have missed it if he had not been paying attention the way he was now. "They saw," Ayanna said quietly, not as a question, and Ethan gave a small nod, his eyes still on the ridge. "I think they did," he replied, and there was no pride in it, no sense of victory, just acknowledgement of something that had passed between them without words. The figure on the ridge settled again, but the stillness was no longer the same. It had shifted, changed, and Ethan felt it, the way a moment can turn without anyone speaking, without anything obvious happening, and yet everything is different afterward. He glanced at Ayanna briefly, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not approval, not relief, but a quiet recognition, as if something he had done had aligned with something she had already known. He looked back toward the ridge, the distance unchanged, the riders still there, but the weight of their presence felt lighter now, not gone, but transformed, and he understood then that whatever they had come to see, it had not required movement, it had required something else entirely. The sun continued its climb, the heat deepening, the shadows shortening, and the day moved forward as it always did, but Ethan no longer felt like he was being carried along by it. He felt like he was standing within it, part of its rhythm instead of apart from it. And as he stood there, the house behind him no longer a place he had entered by chance, the land before him no longer something to cross and leave behind. He realized that the moment those riders had been waiting for had already happened, not in a step, not in a word, but in the quiet decision to remain exactly where he was, and to let that be enough. The shift on the ridge did not turn into movement, not the kind a man could measure in distance or speed, but something quieter, something that changed the way the moment held itself together. And Ethan Cole felt it the same way he felt the wind before it changed direction, subtle, steady, undeniable once noticed. The figures remained where they were, their outlines still against the heat-washed horizon, but the tension that had stretched between them and him had loosened, not gone, just no longer pulling tight against his chest. He let out a slow breath, not because he needed to, but because it came naturally now, and for the first time since he stepped out of that house. He did not feel like he was being measured against something he did not understand. He felt like he had already answered a question he had not been asked out loud. Beside him, Ayana Redhawk stood without shifting her stance, her gaze still resting on the ridge, and there was no urgency in her posture, no signal that something more was expected from him in this moment. "They will not come closer," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded once, not because he had been waiting for them to, but because he could feel that truth settle into place, the way certain things simply became known without needing to be proven. "And they will not leave yet," he added, and she glanced at him briefly, a small acknowledgement that he had begun to understand the rhythm of it. The wind moved again, carrying a faint trace of dust across the ground between them and the distant figures, softening the line that connected them without breaking it, and Ethan watched the way it passed, the way it blurred and then cleared, and he realized that whatever this moment was, it was not meant to be rushed toward an ending. It was meant to be held. He shifted his weight slightly, not out of discomfort, but to feel the ground beneath him again, to remind himself that he was standing in something real, something that did not depend on what he had been before. "So this is the test," he said after a while, his voice low, more a thought than a statement, and Ayana did not answer right away, not because she disagreed, but because she did not need to confirm what he had already begun to see. "It is part of it," she said finally, and that answer, like the others, did not close anything. It opened it, leaving space for more to come. Ethan looked back toward the ridge, his eyes no longer narrowing, no longer searching for signs of movement, just resting there, steady, and he noticed something he had missed before, the way the riders were positioned, not random, not scattered, but placed with intention, each one holding a point along the ridge that formed a quiet line, a boundary that was not drawn in the dirt, but in presence. "They are not just watching me," he said, and Ayana's expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition. "No," she replied. "They are watching what you stand with." And Ethan felt that settle deeper than anything else she had said so far, because it turned the moment again, made it less about him as a man and more about where he had chosen to place himself. He glanced back at the house, the simple structure standing alone behind him, unchanged, and yet no longer just a place he had entered out of hunger. It had become something else, something tied to the land, to her, to whatever these riders recognized from a distance. "And what do I stand with?" he asked, not because he expected a direct answer, but because the question itself felt necessary. Ayana followed his gaze briefly, then returned her eyes to the ridge. "That is what they came to see," she said, and Ethan let out a faint breath, the kind that carried more understanding than frustration, because he could feel it now. This was not a question someone else could answer for him. Not here, not like this. The sun shifted again, the light angling slightly, changing the way the ridge appeared, the figures on it becoming sharper for a moment before softening again. And Ethan noticed how even that small change altered the way the scene felt. Not drastically, just enough to remind him that nothing stayed exactly the same for long. Time passed, slow and steady, and he did not count it, did not measure it in minutes or moments. He let it move the way the wind moved, the way the land held it, and the longer he stood there, the more natural it felt, not as something he was forcing, but as something he was allowing. After a while, one of the riders shifted again, more clearly this time, turning slightly, not toward him, but along the ridge, and another followed, then another, small movements, deliberate, each one breaking the stillness in a way that did not feel like retreat, but like completion. "They are leaving," Ethan said quietly, and Ayanna gave a single nod, her gaze steady. "They have seen enough," she replied, and there was no triumph in her voice, no sense of victory, just acknowledgement that something had been decided without needing to be spoken. Ethan watched as the figures on the ridge began to move along its length, not descending, not approaching, just continuing on their path, their outlines shifting against the light until they became less distinct, then smaller, then part of the horizon itself again. The connection between them faded, not abruptly, but gradually, like a thread being loosened rather than cut, and Ethan felt it in his chest, not as loss, but as release, a tension he had not fully noticed now settling into something quieter. He stood there a moment longer, even after the ridge had emptied, even after the last trace of movement had disappeared into the distance, and the land returned to its steady rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but different in the way it held him. He turned slightly then, not away from the land, but back toward the house, toward Ayanna, and there was something new in the way he carried himself, not heavier, not lighter, just more certain, as if a question had been answered in a way that did not need to be repeated. "That was not for me alone," he said, and Ayanna looked at him, her gaze calm. "No," she answered. "It never was." And in that quiet exchange, Ethan Cole understood that whatever had passed between him and those distant riders had also passed through something larger than himself, something that would continue long after this moment had ended, and for the first time, that did not unsettle him. It grounded him where he stood. The ridge returned to silence, but it was not the same silence that had been there before. It carried the memory of what had just passed, and Ethan Cole stood with his eyes still fixed on the horizon long after the last rider had faded into the distance, as if something in him needed to confirm that the moment had truly ended. The wind moved across the open ground in a slow, even sweep, lifting small trails of dust that caught the light and then disappeared again, and he followed them with his gaze, not searching for anything now, just letting his attention rest where it naturally fell. Beside him, Ayanna Redhawk remained still, her presence steady, unchanged by the departure of the riders, as if their coming and going had been part of a pattern she had known long before he arrived. "It feels different," Ethan said quietly, not turning toward her, his voice carrying more observation than question, because the shift was clear to him now, not in the land itself, but in the way it settled around him. Ayanna nodded once, her gaze still outward. "Because you are different in it," she replied, and the words did not sound like praise, they sounded like recognition, simple and unadorned. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind that did not carry tension with it anymore, just air moving in and out, steady and unforced, and he realized that for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what came next in terms of escape or survival. He was thinking about what came next in terms of staying. He turned slightly then, his eyes moving from the horizon back toward the house, toward the place that had drawn him in with hunger and now held him with something else entirely, something he could not yet name but no longer needed to question. "So that was them deciding," he said, and Ayanna's eyes shifted to him briefly. "It was them seeing," she corrected, and the distinction settled into him, subtle but important, because it meant that what had happened was not a judgment handed down, it was an understanding reached. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting that, because it matched what he had felt, the absence of pressure, the absence of threat, the quiet acknowledgement that had passed between them without words. He took a few steps back toward the doorway, not retreating, not leaving the land behind, just returning to the space where both worlds seemed to meet. And as he crossed that threshold again, he noticed the difference in himself, how the movement no longer felt like crossing into something unfamiliar. It felt like stepping into a place he had begun to belong to. Inside, the room remained as it had been. The table, the bread, the silver bracelet catching the light, unchanged, and yet everything in it felt different now, as if the space itself had expanded beyond its walls. He paused just inside, his hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair, feeling the solid wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the present, and he realized that the simplicity of the room no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Ayanna followed him in, her steps quiet, unhurried, and she moved toward the table, her fingers once again resting near the bracelet without picking it up, as if its presence alone was enough. "You stayed," she said, and Ethan looked at her, meeting her gaze fully now, not guarded, not uncertain. "I did," he replied, and the words carried a weight that had nothing to do with obligation. They carried choice. She studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not testing him, just seeing him as he stood, and then she gave a small nod, a gesture that felt like something being acknowledged rather than granted. "Then you will understand more," she said, and Ethan felt a faint shift in his chest, not anticipation, not fear, just a readiness that had not been there before. He glanced at the bracelet then, the silver catching his eye again, and for the first time, he saw it not as something to take, not even as something to return, but as something that marked the beginning of what had unfolded, a quiet anchor to the moment that had changed everything. "That belongs to you," he said, gesturing slightly toward it, and Ayana's gaze followed his, her expression steady. "It belongs to this place," she replied, and the answer settled deeper than he expected, because it removed the idea of ownership entirely, placing the object into something larger, something that did not belong to a single person. Ethan considered that, nodding slowly, because it fit with everything else he had begun to see, that this land, this house, even the moments he had stepped into, were not meant to be held in the way he had always understood possession. He moved closer to the table, not reaching for the bracelet, just standing near it, letting its presence remain what it was, and he realized that the need to take, to claim, to make something his, had begun to loosen its grip on him. "What happens now?" he asked, and this time the question did not carry urgency. It carried openness, as if he was ready to accept whatever answer came without needing to shape it. Ayana looked at him, her gaze steady, and for the first time, there was something in it that resembled approval, not given freely, not easily, but present all the same. "Now," she said, "you begin to see beyond yourself." And the words settled into the room, quiet and certain, not as an end, but as the beginning of something that would unfold in its own time. Ethan stood there, the light shifting slowly across the floor, the land stretching out beyond the walls, and he understood that whatever path he had stepped onto did not lead away from this place. It led deeper into it, into something that would not be measured in miles or days, but in moments like the one he had just lived through, steady, deliberate, and impossible to turn back from once it had begun. The room held the quiet differently now, not as something waiting to be filled, but as something already complete, and Ethan Cole stood near the table with his eyes resting on the silver bracelet, not drawn to it the way he had been before, but aware of it, like a marker that did not need to be moved to be understood. The light had shifted again, softer now as the afternoon began its slow descent, stretching shadows longer across the wooden floor, and the air inside carried a faint warmth that settled into the walls, steady and unhurried. He ran a hand along the edge of the table, feeling the grain beneath his fingers, the small imperfections that told a story of time rather than ownership, and he realized that everything in this place seemed to exist without needing to be claimed, without needing to be proven. "Beyond myself," he repeated quietly, not as a question, but as a phrase he was turning over, testing the shape of it against what he knew, and finding that it did not fit into the patterns he had lived by. But that did not make it wrong, it made it new. Ayana Redhawk stood across from him, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and she did not rush to explain what he would come to understand in his own time. "Most men never look past what they need," she said after a moment, her voice calm, not judging, just stating what she had seen. "They take, they move on, and they believe that is enough." And Ethan let out a slow breath, because he recognized himself in those words, not in a way that stung, but in a way that clarified something he had not been willing to see before. "It was enough," he said, his voice low, "until it was not." And the admission came without resistance, without defense, just truth. Ayana inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing more that needed to be said in that space. Ethan's gaze shifted toward the doorway, the open frame leading back to the land he had just stood in, and he realized that the boundary between inside and outside had begun to blur, not physically, but in the way he understood it, as if the house was no longer separate from the land, but part of it, just as he was beginning to be. "What do I see first?" he asked after a while, not because he expected a direct answer, but because the question itself felt like the next step, the next place to begin. Ayanna turned slightly, her eyes moving toward the far wall where a simple object rested, something Ethan had not paid attention to before, a small wooden box, worn at the edges, its surface marked by time and use. She stepped toward it, her movement quiet, and opened it without ceremony, revealing nothing remarkable at first glance, just a few simple items, a folded piece of cloth, a small carved stone, and something else, something that caught the light in a way that drew his attention. She reached in and lifted it carefully, holding it between her fingers, and as she turned back toward him, he saw it clearly, a second bracelet, similar to the one on the table, but older, the silver darker, the surface worn smooth in places where it had been handled many times. She did not hand it to him. She simply held it where he could see it, and said, "This was given, not taken," and the words settled differently than anything else she had said, because they carried a history he could not see, a meaning that extended beyond the object itself. Ethan stepped closer, not reaching for it, just observing, and he noticed the small details, the way the metal had been shaped, the marks that spoke of hands and time rather than value, and he realized that what he was looking at was not something to own, it was something to understand. "Who gave it?" he asked, and Ayanna's gaze softened slightly, not in emotion, but in memory. "Someone who stayed," she said, and the answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it connected directly to the choice he had made, the one he was still standing in. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the bracelet in her hand to the one on the table. The two connected in a way that did not need to be explained, one representing what had been offered, the other what had been taken and returned. "And now?" he asked, his voice quieter now, not searching, just open, and Ayanna looked at him fully, her gaze steady. "Now you decide what you give," she said, and the words settled into him, not as a demand, but as an invitation, one that did not come with instructions or expectations, just possibility. Ethan stood there, the room quiet around him, the land stretching beyond the walls, and he felt the weight of the moment not as something heavy, but as something real, something that asked for more than just presence. It asked for intention. He glanced once more at the bracelet on the table, then back at the one in her hand, and for the first time, he did not think about taking either of them. He thought about what it meant to leave something behind, not out of loss, but out of choice. The light shifted again, softer now, the day moving toward evening, and Ethan Cole understood that what lay ahead would not be marked by sudden change or clear answers, but by small decisions, quiet ones, made in moments like this, where no one was watching, and yet everything mattered. And as he stood there, between what he had been and what he was beginning to become, he realized that seeing beyond himself was not about looking farther. It was about standing still long enough to recognize what had always been there, waiting for him to choose it. The weight of the moment did not press down on Ethan Cole. It settled into him, quiet and steady, like something that had found its place without force, and he stood there with his eyes moving between the bracelet in Ayanna's hand and the one resting on the table, understanding now that neither of them were objects to be held. They were markers, reflections of choices made and choices yet to come. The air in the room had cooled slightly as the sun began its slow descent, the light softening, stretching longer across the floor, and the shadows no longer felt like something to step around. They felt like part of the rhythm he had begun to follow. He took a slow breath, letting it settle fully before speaking. "I have never given anything that was not meant to be traded." And the words came out without hesitation, not as an excuse, but as a truth he had carried for longer than he had realized. Ayanna Redhawk watched him, her gaze steady, and there was no judgment in it, only recognition, as if she had heard that truth before from others who had stood where he stood now. "Then this is where it changes," she said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement left no room for argument, no space for doubt, just a path placed in front of him without direction on how to walk it. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes lowering briefly to the table, to the bread, to the bracelet, and he realized that everything he had done since stepping into this place had been guided by something. outside himself. Hunger, instinct, survival. But now the next step would not come from any of those. It would come from something else entirely. He moved closer to the table, not with urgency, not with hesitation, just with intention, and he reached out, his hand hovering for a moment above the bracelet he had once tried to take, feeling the weight of the moment in that small distance between his fingers and the silver. Then he lowered his hand, not to pick it up, but to turn it slightly, aligning it with the light, and in that simple motion, he saw it differently, not as something valuable, but as something placed, something that held meaning because of where it rested, not because of what it was made of. He let his hand fall back to his side and stepped away again, choosing not to touch it further, and in that choice, he felt something settle in him, a quiet certainty that did not need to be confirmed. "I do not take it," he said, his voice low, steady, and Ayana inclined her head slightly, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of what he had already done. "And what do you give?" she asked, and the question did not demand an answer, it invited one, leaving space for him to find it in his own time. Ethan stood still for a long moment, the room quiet around him, the land beyond the walls stretching wide and patient, and he realized that giving was not something he could rush, not something he could decide with the same instinct that had driven him to take. He closed his eyes briefly, not to block anything out, but to listen again, the way he had begun to learn, and in that brief stillness, he felt it, not a voice, not a thought, but a direction. Subtle, steady, coming from the same place that had guided him to remain when he could have left. When he opened his eyes, his gaze shifted not to the table, not to the bracelet, but to the door, to the open space beyond it, and without speaking, he turned and walked toward it, his steps slow, deliberate, not driven by urgency, but by understanding. He stepped outside again, the light softer now, the air cooler as the day leaned toward evening, and he moved a few steps into the open land, stopping where the ground met a patch of dry grass that bent gently under the wind. He looked out across the horizon, the ridge now empty, the space where the riders had been holding only the memory of their presence, and he felt no pull to follow them, no need to chase what had already passed. Instead, he knelt down slowly, his hand reaching toward the ground, not to take anything from it, but to touch it, to feel its texture, its steadiness, and for a moment he remained there, grounded, present, connected to something that did not belong to him, but that he had chosen to stand with. He removed his hand from the earth and rested it briefly over his chest, not as a gesture meant to be seen, but as something instinctive, something that marked the moment in a way he could not fully explain. Then he stood again and turned back toward the house, toward Ayana, who remained in the doorway, watching not with expectation, but with quiet understanding. When he stepped back inside, he did not look at the bracelet first. He looked at her, meeting her gaze fully, and said, "I stay, not because I owe, but because I choose." And the words carried a weight that settled into the space between them, not heavy, but real. Ayana studied him for a moment, her eyes steady, and then she gave a small nod, the kind that does not mark an ending, but recognizes a beginning. "Then you have already given something," she said, and Ethan felt that truth settle into him, not as something finished, but as something that would continue, moment by moment, choice by choice. The light in the room softened further, the day moving steadily toward evening, and Ethan Cole understood that what he had given was not an object, not something that could be held or returned. It was something quieter, something that would shape everything that came next, and for the first time, that did not feel like a burden. It felt like a path he was ready to walk. The light faded slowly across the land, not in a sudden fall, but in a quiet surrender, the kind that turns sharp edges into soft lines and leaves everything touched by a gentler truth. And Ethan Cole stood just inside the doorway, watching the horizon shift from gold to amber, then deeper into the calm of evening, his breathing steady, his stance grounded in a way he had never known before. Nothing in the world around him had changed. In the way men usually measure change, the house was the same. The land stretched just as far. The wind moved with the same quiet rhythm, and yet everything felt different, because he was no longer standing against it. He was standing within it. Behind him, the small wooden box remained open on the table, the older bracelet resting inside. the newer one catching the last threads of light where he had left it, untouched, unclaimed. And for the first time, he did not feel the pull to reach for it. Not because it had lost value, but because he had found something that did not need to be held to be understood. Ayana Redhawk stood near the far wall, her presence as steady as the land itself, and she did not speak, did not move to close the distance between them, because there was nothing left to guide, nothing left to explain, only something left to be lived. Ethan stepped forward slowly, not toward the table this time, not toward the objects that had marked his beginning, but toward the open doorway again, and he paused there, looking out at the land as it settled into evening, the distant ridges now dark shapes against a dimming sky, the air cooling just enough to carry a different kind of silence, one that did not wait, one that simply existed. He took a breath, deep and unforced, and let it out slowly, feeling the moment pass through him without resistance, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to not chase what came next, but to let it arrive. "It is quiet," he said, his voice low, not breaking the silence but becoming part of it, and Ayana answered from behind him, her tone just as calm. It always was. And there was something in that exchange that settled deeper than any lesson, because it was not about the land changing. It was about him finally hearing it. He stepped out onto the ground once more, the dust soft beneath his boots, the air cooler against his skin, and he walked a few paces forward, stopping where the light faded into shadow. Not crossing it, not avoiding it, just standing at the edge of both. He looked down briefly, noticing his own footprints in the dirt, the ones from earlier still faintly visible, and he realized something simple, something that had never mattered to him before. They did not lead away, they led here, and they ended where he stood. He lifted his gaze again, the horizon now a quiet line between earth and sky, and he felt no need to measure the distance, no need to imagine what lay beyond it, because for the first time, he was not looking for somewhere else to go. Behind him, the house stood as it always had, simple, still, but no longer distant, no longer separate. It had become part of the same space he now occupied, a place not defined by walls, but by presence. Ayana stepped out behind him then, her movement quiet, and she came to stand beside him once more, not ahead, not behind, just beside, her gaze resting on the same horizon, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The wind moved gently across the land, carrying the last warmth of the day away, and in its place came a cooler stillness, one that did not press, did not demand, it simply remained. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, feeling the ground beneath him, and he realized that this simple act of standing, of breathing, of being present without reaching for something else, was the thing he had never known how to do before. "What happens tomorrow?" he asked after a while, not because he needed an answer, but because the question itself had changed. It no longer came from a place of urgency. It came from a place of quiet curiosity. Ayana turned her head slightly, looking at him, and there was something in her expression now that had not been there before, not new, but revealed, a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken. "Tomorrow," she said, "you wake up and do not forget this." And the words settled into the evening air, not as a rule, not as a warning, but as a simple truth. Ethan nodded once, slowly, because he understood that more than anything else, that what had happened here would not matter if it did not carry forward, if it did not shape the way he moved, the way he saw, the way he chose. The last light slipped below the horizon, leaving the land in a calm, even dusk, and the world did not end. It did not change in any dramatic way. It simply continued, steady, quiet, unchanged in its rhythm. Ethan Cole stood there, beside a woman who had never needed to force him to stay, on land that had never needed to claim him, and for the first time in his life, he did not feel like a man passing through. He felt like a man who had arrived without needing to go anywhere else. And as the silence settled fully around them, not heavy, not empty, just complete, he understood something that did not need to be spoken, that out here, nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been given to him in the way he once understood those things. Something else had happened, something quieter, something that would not fade with the light, and he stood there, saying nothing, because for the first time, silence was enough.